Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Implementing an Enterprise Data Classification Strategy in Schema in Highly Regulated Industries. A couple of housekeeping items before I do introductions. We would like to keep this somewhat interactive if possible. Many folks tend to have conversations questions regarding the subject matter, so feel free to go ahead and type those questions in the chat window. We'll attempt to get to those in real time as much as possible. We do that so that we can keep the answers somewhat timely to the content that we are presenting. So with me today is Scott Giordano. Scott is a well-regarded data privacy attorney and actually the creator of the first law school course in electronic evidence discovery, a member of the California, District of Columbia, and Washington State Bar Association. Scott has more than 20 years in practice. Good day, Scott.
Thanks for having me on board.
Excellent. And myself, I'm Gabriel Gums. I'm Spirion's Vice President of Product Strategy. I, too, have been in the industry for quite some time. Started as an ethical hacker, security consultant, security architect, practitioner, information security officer, and so forth. My job here is largely to transform our strategic vision into product execution. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's get right into it. We've got a lot of content to present today. So what Scott will be showing us is a data classification template model. This is version 1.3. We've been through several iterations of this, of which it's been implemented at a number of organizations throughout the U.S. and a couple overseas. Scott, if you would, I'd let you take it from here.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you again for that intro. Gabe, one thing I do want to mention, actually three things I'd like to mention before I get started going through the data classification template model, is that if you leave with nothing else, I'd like you all to leave with this. One is that in my experience in the past year or so, I've seen data privacy and data security requirements starting to merge into one big discipline. And I think that really the instigator of this whole thing was the General Data Protection Regulation for the EU. I know that came online a couple months ago. It's going to go into effect in May of 2018, but everyone is already working like mad to get started with that. So I think that was really the catalyst for that. And so as a consequence, I think that highly regulated industries require a different approach to addressing all the many requirements that you have. So whether it's data security, data privacy, there's just so much out there, and more of the same simply is not going to work. Simply layering on more controls after control is not going to work. And I know this has been my experience certainly at a formerly highly regulated company when I was in the defense and aerospace industry. And then thirdly, I believe that a complete data classification system offers perhaps the best cost-effective methodology for meeting all of those many regulations that highly regulated industries have to adhere to, such as healthcare and banking and defense and aerospace and so forth. So those are the three takeaways I'd like you all to have today. And so with that, I'd like to talk about this data classification model or system, if you will. You're seeing, I'm just going to review these very briefly before we dive right into it. 6 parts. First is the impact calculus. So what's the scope of the risk? As you might imagine, privacy and security controls are now really required to be risk adjusted. So it's not a question of just dropping in controls. They have to be adjusted according to the risk and appropriate to the risk under the circumstance. Also, it begs the question about reasonable controls and so forth under the circumstances that many of the statutes cite. So impact calculus really answers that question about what's the scope of the risk. Secondly, classes and controls. So how do you draft a series of data classification classes, if you will, and corresponding controls? And there's a lot of art to that. It's not just science. Thirdly, creating a system to go and discover and classify and label that data that's highly regulated. And I know certainly we'll talk about that in some depth. I know, Gabe, you're going to talk about that as well. Fourthly is applying controls. So we talked about creating controls, but actually applying them, and how does data classification controls add to the value of your other controls. We'll talk about monitoring and measuring. So what's the idea behind having an early warning system so that you know someone is perhaps moving controlled information to places it shouldn't be, whether it's accidental, whether it's intentional, and more likely it's going to be accidental, which is more dangerous. Yes, I like to joke to my clients, it's much more difficult to defend against negligence than it is to defend against intentional acts, because negligent acts can be so subtle. And then finally, the idea of auditing and testing. You're familiar probably, in fact almost certainly, with Sarbanes-Oxley testing and so forth that you have to do periodically to make sure that everything's up to snuff. That same principle applies for any kind of a control set, not just for Sarbanes-Oxley. So with that, let's dig right into our first.
Before you jump ahead, Scott, I want to shine a light, especially on the first two parts of your system before we move forward, because I think it's extremely important for security professionals to adjust some of their language and their thinking a bit more towards this business reality. Which the first is, as you start to dig deeper into the impact calculus, understanding that being risk adjusted. When we're talking about risk, we're talking about the likelihood of an impact and the impact that event would have, not the old vulnerability times threat model that is pretty outdated for our modern data protection needs. And on top of that, when we talk about classes and controls, you mentioned a few minutes earlier that simply adding more controls is not going to automatically or magically, for that matter, get us to a more mature state of protection. And what I like to talk about and highlight, and we'll be looking at this later, are the different forms of controls and the different ways that we need to apply these, not just technological controls, but the people and process ones as well. So I just wanted to make sure I kind of put a big underline under those two as we move forward.
Yes, I agree. I think that's brilliant.
All right, let's do it. So,
impact calculus. I mentioned earlier that the impact calculus define the scope of the risk, and if we have a couple options for developing that impact calculus. And again, I'm going to work from my experience. I think it makes the most tangible sense. Certainly, if you go to the next slide where we see the continuum of different impact calculus approaches, it ranges from the simple, something very qualitative, that you literally make a statement about the potential impact, versus something comprehensive where you have lots of variables, lots of figures, and the ability to really reduce those down to a value, and then you have parts in between. So for our purposes today, we're really going to touch upon the first two. Again, simple is what I used, and the reason I use simple is because I had a very short deadline. I believe the CISO walked into my office my first week on the job at my last company and said, we need a data classification scheme, and we need much time, and certainly didn't have the time or the data to really go into depth as to what the scope of the impact was. But I knew qualitatively what it was. I knew that there was a likelihood of significant adverse impact to the organization or to the employees or others if certain classes of data escaped, as we use the phrase. And so I simply put a qualitative statement among the different categories, and you'll see that when we actually look at the sample data classification matrix. So that worked for me. However, if you have more data, and in many cases more is better, mid-tier is a good way to go. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what mid-tier may look like. It presumes you have some information. It's not a lot, but you've got some to work with. So here you're seeing the input worksheet for the classification template. And notice I have 5 classes here. You won't necessarily have 5. You may have 4. You may have 3. Okay, and we'll talk about the whys and wherefores of that in a minute, how many classes you want to have. But you'll notice that on what you see, line 29, you can see that. We see the primary loss factors. So what's the potential loss factors? Well, if you lose control of the item, whatever it is, then it's the question of what's the value of that item, either because it's unique and you can't replace it, or perhaps the diminution in value if a competitor has copied it or a foreign government has copied it. So you have that cost. You have the value of the loss in terms of time, how many hours. This is insidious because it's amazing how many hours you will spend internally on chasing these things down once there's a breach or an escape or what have you. There's the value of lost business. If you have contracts, and the contracts say under certain circumstances you have to notify your business partners you've lost their data, etc. Then you also have advanced quantitative ones, and you see line 37. So you have your stock price decline if you're publicly traded. You have regulatory inquiries and investigations, which are a huge black hole for time and money. And then finally, you have other qualitative ones like your reputation winding up in the news. I mean, if you just Google data breaches, for example, you'll find that there are so many organizations that have been in the news and are constantly being the target of litigation. These are the kind of opportunities to wind up in textbooks and not really the good kind of opportunity. So that's an input worksheet. Here's what an output worksheet may look like. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that you'll get orders of magnitude of potential value of the risk. So in this case, let's say that you have in the third column proprietary and sensitive or class 3 information. So that control data, depending on how you've set up your system, that may be simply trade secrets. That may be regular personal data, so names and addresses and so forth. So however you define that, and we'll talk about that in a minute, then the scope is then going to be what you see in a respective column. So the direct monetary loss may be between $1 million and $100 million. You may consume 100 hours of time just chasing down all of the variables here and finding out what exactly went wrong. You may have a 15% decline in your stock value. Regulatory inquiries, if it is a Office of Controller of the Currency, or if it is the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Civil Rights, what have you, but all of that is going to factor into the potential scope of the risk, and as a consequence, then you're going to say, yes, the significant impact is dollar value is this, and so as a consequence, our controls should be this, and that's the model. And I'll give you an example from my own experience. If we go to the next slide, you'll see how this might work in a defense industry. So say that you lost what's called controlled unclassified information. So this is the technical materials that you would use to build an aircraft, for example. And it could be any kind of aircraft that's used in a military capacity. Well, direct monetary loss, you may not have any. You may have copies of these diagrams somewhere else, another server. But the value of the loss in terms of diminution of value may be huge. If a state actor has grabbed this and they can now manufacture this part that you've spent years developing, that may be a huge loss, especially if they're selling it on the black market. There may be lots of time. In fact, there's certainly lots of time, and I know I spent working on these things, and it goes into the hundreds and hundreds of hours because you'll typically have a team working on them. So you have the value of your time. I didn't include all the other associated values, but there are bigger ones. Again, having to notify your business partners that you've lost their data. They're not thrilled with that, to say the least. The threat that the State Department is going to tell you can't sell any more military goods. That's a very scary thing. That may be half your business. So this was just a good example of how this mid-tier approach works. And while it's not as precise as some other methodologies, at least gives you a fairly good figure of what the scope is.
So Scott, let me ask a couple of questions.
Please do.
I want to jump back one.
Sure.
I apologize. One, if you would, and talk about how you came up with the different tiers. I assume that this didn't happen in just a bubble, right? And I kind of want to, for our audience, kind of shed a little light on all of the players that were involved in feeding input back to developing this part of the process.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to discuss that. And in fact, that'll be, I think, illuminated in some of the slides that we have following. But just for the edification of all of our audience here today, what I did was I talked to the stakeholders. I said, okay, well, what's the potential impact of losing data X, whatever it might be? Again, this may be the blueprints for some critical parts in military gear. Okay, what's the impact of losing attorney-client privilege information? What's the impact of losing regular sensitive information, like just the personal data, someone's social security number? So I really got some very good ideas of just the scope of that, both politically and economically. And then I started sketching out some classes and saying, okay, well, in an ideal world, here's what my classes would look like. And then I went to our CISO and said, okay, great, here's in my ideal world what classes look like. What kind of controls would be ideal for this? And then we talked through different kinds of controls, and then I sketched those out. I said, okay, is this really going to be politically acceptable? And if it's not, then we need to move some things into some different columns. And so it's an iterative process, and it's something that requires, at a minimum, someone from legal, someone from your CISO's office or IT, someone from any stakeholder that has critical data, like, for example, lines of business that manufacture defense articles, or if you're a healthcare organization, then the people that are actually responsible for your healthcare information, or if you're a medical devices manufacturer, then who's responsible for that data set that comes with the medical device itself. So you always have to find a line of business people that have their hands on the data and probably don't have any idea what kind of controls are already in place. You have to have those folks. HR folks, always HR is involved because of employee data, especially for your non-U.S. folks. Employee data may be treated in a little more in a sensitive manner than it would be here in the U.S., just for political reasons, and also because the fines can be pretty explosive now over in the EU. So those are just some good examples of how I started this process and then wound through it in an iterative process.
You mentioned lawyer several times. I take it there's always a lawyer, isn't there?
There's always a lawyer. That's not my mantra. It's the mantra of my former CISO, because it seems like every time there was a question that came up on compliance, whether it was from a security or a privacy aspect, they had to call me. And so I spent a lot of time in the CISO's office resolving all these many legal questions.
I take that as a good thing personally, and in my experience in the past, it wasn't until after there was an issue that we had engaged, legal in general. We certainly see a shift in that quite a bit these days. In fact, I've even seen, it's not a large number, but a small number of financial services organizations having some of the risk functions report directly into legal themselves, which is arguable whether that is the right place to have it or not, but it certainly did reflect the organization's thinking with regards to how they viewed risk on the whole.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, and it's a sign of the times, for better or for worse. I'm not saying that that mantra came up by accident. It's clear that just everything requires an eye from legal, just because of the potential for liability.
Indeed. All right, let's keep it moving.
Sure.
So where were we?
Just past this is the next slide, is creating classes and controls. So I already talked to you about how we went through that iterative process. Now we'll show you what that might look like. And so what you're going to see here is a sample of classes and candidate control. This is based on something I did in the past, and my former employer was gracious enough to let me use a portion of it to demonstrate here. So you can see that in the middle column, I'm sorry, I guess in the 1, 2, 3 rows down, where we talk about severity of the consequences and the handling, that's the impact calculus, and you can see the different flavors of that. If it's a blue class, so proprietary but not sensitive, then a disclosure or a loss or an escape would not significantly impact the company. So that's a good example of why that would be in blue. Whereas with yellow, results in significant adverse impact to the organization. And you can see some of the types of data in that in the yellow category. It could be personal data from a non-U.S. standpoint, so as defined by the data directive, for example. It could be HIPAA control data here in the U.S., attorney-client privilege materials, and so on and so forth. So as a consequence, then those controls, those sample controls, if you will, here, you can see in the bottom row where it says access is restricted to named individuals and then you must include appropriate notices regarding document sensitivity and so forth. So some good candidate controls for that. Now we also have candidate controls for different media. If you go to the next slide, you will see that I have different media listed here. So for example, I had all kinds of electronic media, I had paper, just everything. But this is just a good example of one piece of it. So if you were doing email sent outside of a company office, so to a third party, for example, and it was class 4, restricted. So you couldn't email, period, unless you had appropriate controls in place that had been approved by the Data Classification Committee, and we'll talk about that committee in a bit. But you could not broadcast to a distribution list, for example. You had to identify the recipient before you sent it, and we actually had a system built in where we could differentiate between internal and external folks. Like that, that's the controls that were in place for email, as an example. So just some sample controls, again, that are from an electronic media standpoint. And then if you look at the next slide in line here, I've kind of teased this a bit. We'll talk about this more in a minute. But towards the bottom here, you can see different files, and they have different classification colors. And this is what it might look like in reality, but it's also a good example of what you as an end user might see in terms of what classification is appended or is embedded into a particular file.
That's excellent. And to kind of shine we're going to get to this in a second. I'll be talking about this a little bit more further on, but we included here kind of a look at what some of this looks like in practice as a technological control as well. So what you see represented there are the classes of data that have been defined by that working group that Scott talked about, collaboration between the lawyers and the CISO and all the stakeholders and the privacy counsel and so forth. That policy going from one that lives simply on paper to one that is executed throughout the environment across documents as they're created and ones that existed, and this visual representation of that based upon the application of those controls. All right.
Okay, so next step then is in this particular phase is we create the classes, we assign candidate controls, and what do I mean by that? So the touchstone here for assigning controls, again, how much control granularity do you need? And the more you need, the more classes or categories, as you want to call them, that you need. And I'll give you an example. When I first sent my initial data classification matrix, that's what we were just looking at, to one of the senior VPs for review, one of the first comments was, oh, well, why don't we just collapse that into 3 categories? We don't need 5. And I said, okay, well, if we do, then we're going to either be pushing one class of category into class's control, meaning that class 2 now goes into class 3's controls or vice versa. So either you're going to have to live with much less strength of controls for a given category, or a given category is going to have a lot more in the way of controls than perhaps you'd want to have. How do you want to resolve that? And so ultimately, that was rejected, and we kept the 5 categories. So a lot of it's going to have to do with granularity. It's also going to have to do with politics. And I'll give you an example. Attorney-client privilege materials. They're considered, in my view, class 4. So in the red class, for example, meaning that you can't fax them. Now, good luck trying to convince attorneys not to fax things. I tried and it didn't work. And so I had to move that to one class lower, even though I would have desired this to be class 4. If no one's going to follow your controls, there's no point in having that. You're better off in at least having them file some controls. So hence why attorney-client privilege wound up getting dropped to class 3, which is orange or yellow, I believe. And we simply had to be satisfied with those controls, which I'm not in love with. But again, politically, if no one's going to use the controls, you're out of luck. So as the last point here says, classification is often a political issue, not just a technological one. It really is true. You're going to find that the technology is not your biggest challenge. And unfortunately, it begs the question about, who says, what classes happen ultimately of resolving those disputes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Gabe, did you have a question or a comment about that?
I had a comment actually.
Sure.
In practice, there's another reality as to why that collapsing and sometimes that necessity to maybe loosen controls is very important. Again, something we'll talk about in a moment, but there is a reality that we also have to do what we say we're going to do, and if we simply, for the purpose of creating these classes and controls, stayed within the first example, Scott, where you had the 5 and then were asked to move down to 3. If you stayed with the 3 and were not adhering to those controls simply because the policy existed, you would still fail. Well, you should hopefully fail an internal audit, and you are performing those before external auditors come along. But for example, the SEC will just as soon not flag you for not having a specific type of written control in place or policy in place and flag you for that, as opposed to having it and not executing it. So you certainly need to think about those things as you build and expand outwards.
Agreed. No, that's an excellent point. Also, as a follow-up to what you're saying, all this implicates something else, and that is that you're going to need a data classification committee to essentially run this whole thing. Trying to do it, have one person be in charge of this whole thing, it's just not going to work. There are just too many variables. So again, from a political standpoint, you're going to need a data classification committee. And so we had one that was involved. We had, not surprisingly, someone from legal, someone from IT security, HR. We had the folks from overseas involved because this was going to be something they were going to have to adhere to, so we wanted them involved at that level. Because it begs the question, suppose I say this is a class 3 and someone else says no, it's a class 4, who resolves that? So you have to answer all these questions. They have to be enshrined in policy, and then that has to be enforced through controls and then through the auditing and testing that we're going to describe. That's really, in a nutshell, this process. And having that data classification committee really was crucial to addressing it ahead of time, because we knew these questions were going to come up.
Excellent. All right, let's move along.
So, with that, we'll go to discover, classify, and label. So when we say discover, classify, and label, we literally mean that there's going to be a mechanical process where you're going to go through your entire information ecosystem, discover the kinds of data that we're looking for, and search for anything that's particularly of interest, that's sensitive, and making sure that's classified appropriately according to the schema that you just set up. So Gabe, if you would, if you could talk about the mechanical process of how that works, that would be a big help, I think.
Absolutely. So this is where the technological controls begin dovetailing with the process controls. And as Scott mentioned, the importance of these activities and beginning with the discovery process with regards to our vision of that, everything starts with our data platform, the Spirion data platform. And we begin by searching everywhere. So looking everywhere for all of those classes and labels that we've already defined. We start by doing that on premises throughout all endpoints and servers environments. Start to stretch that out into cloud environments, as we now see data starting to move its way further outside of the perimeters. There's many of those that will argue that the traditional perimeter doesn't exist at all. Regardless of how you see that kind of play out within your environment, the truth is that data now is being created and housed and used outside it within cloud environments as well. Images and PDFs and things of that nature. So when looking at unstructured environments, this is where we're seeing more of this type of sensitive information find its way throughout the environment. Emails for sure are a large vector for this as well too. So when we say search everywhere, we literally mean we have to begin looking for these things everywhere. We've spent the time, we've developed these policies, we've created these committees, and now executing it. That first step begins with your ability to locate everywhere, and then to find any and everything. There are some data types that are somewhat easier to locate. I say that with kind of an asterisk because there's nothing commoditized about the ability to locate, say, a social security number. It is not a bygone conclusion that that activity can be performed with ultimate accuracy unless there's some care given to that and the proper types of systems used. Pardon me. So what does that mean? Well, the only thing that is more harmful than a false negative in that sense is or false positive in that sense is a false negative. And so we need to be able to find anything, and that includes intellectual property. So a lot of the things that Scott and colleagues such as his would be working on, that is the lawyer, so to speak, is going to contain a fair amount of intellectual property. The same is true for some of the other data types that we highlighted early on in this session. And then being able, once you've determined those classes, apply persistent metadata labels throughout all of those. So we saw that in a screenshot earlier as well, where we had tags on the data themselves. And so the ability to perform that activity means that the classification strategy that you've used, the schema that you've built, can now attach itself to the documents and the data within your environment and live persistently throughout as they move around, as they're shared, as they're copied, as they're emailed, as they're saved in other locations, and so on. All right.
Gabe, I had a question for you real quick before we go on. One of the experiences I had in the past is working in investigations is being able to plug in a data set and just using regex, just sift through the whole thing and find things. Why can't I just do that right now and just turn regex loose throughout the whole network and see what comes back?
That's an excellent question. So the first reason why that is not ideal is you're going to have quite a lot of noise simply using just a regex pattern. It's impossible to craft the regex that is going to be granular enough or intelligent enough to also understand the context of information. So a number that may otherwise look like a certain pattern, again, let's take a social security number, may not necessarily be a social security number. Here's a real life scenario. Certain types of streaming media pass bits where we see that reflected in logs and in different places in the environment as actual. It looks like it. That's to say, it matches a pattern of social security numbers. It's not. These are media files that are streaming across the wire, and in fact, that just comes back as a whole lot of noise. So you create this scenario where you burden your IT and your security staff with having to sift through mountains of data that aren't actionable. One of the other reasons is, again, as I mentioned, the false negative. So the only thing worse than all that noise and creating all this extra work for your team is missing things that are actual and do require your attention. Those are going to be the ones that come back and actually will result in you going through that chart you created earlier and being subject to those fines and things of that nature. And we're starting to see those fines increase quite heavily, right? You know, it's went from just fines for an overall incident to fines per every record that is exposed. And in the case of GDPR, for example, tying that directly to revenue. So simply applying regex will not allow you to have the intelligence, the context built into search in. It also is enabled to do things like OCR searching, for example. So you're going to be blind to things that aren't just in plain text, and you're going to be blind to any context within which those documents are created and so forth.
Excellent. Well, and let me just, if I can follow on, you mentioned GDPR. One of the challenges of GDPR is how they define personal data.
That's
because it used to be that personal data was just your contact information and so forth, national identification numbers, things like that. But now they have this concept of online identifiers. So your user ID, for example, is now a personal data. So is any kind of device ID you may have, an IP address. Even though you necessarily doesn't tie to a certain person, is still considered personal data. And that includes dynamic IP addresses, which typically the IT folks find shocking, that the authorities would consider a dynamic IP address to be personal data, but it is. cookies, not surprisingly, mobile device identifiers, advertising IDs to the extent they still exist. Just about anything can be personal data now, and it's too easy, in my view anyway, to get either false negatives, as you described earlier, and miss something than otherwise. And it's a consideration I don't think people really appreciate until they dig into this and they realize that the scope of this is a lot bigger than perhaps at first glance.
That's an excellent point. That last sentence is a paraphrase, or it sounds very similar anyway to the sentiments from a number of CISOs that were in attendance of an event that we held recently. When asked to summarize and kind of wrap up a panel discussion we were having, the common sentiment that everyone expressed was that the scope of this is far larger than anyone had imagined walking into it. They certainly backed that up with some positive attitudes, namely it was accomplishable, but that was the key takeaway that they really wanted everyone to understand, and I think it's fair or necessary to echo that as well and kind of underline what you just said there again too, Scott, because that is extremely important. The scope of this is larger than we imagine, and it continues to grow.
Agreed. Why don't we do this? Let's talk about applying control. So this is our fourth step. And you're all in the audience undoubtedly familiar with the application of controls, but there's really different flavors of this. So if we, in fact, go to our next slide here, you're going to have the controls that are prescribed by, as I like to joke, your favorite control set. You may not be in love with it, but it's a control set you have to use. So that could be the cybersecurity framework. It could be NIST, COBIT. It could be ISO 27K. And in fact, most, if not all of these favorite control sets have their own requirements or control, if you will, for information or data classification. So, for example, for ISO 27K, they specifically have control A821 and 22, that's classification and labeling of data. So, a good example of that. But then you also have controls that are related specifically to data classification from the data classification system itself. So, Gabe, let's talk a little bit more about that. How does that work for applying those particular set of controls?
Well, so as you mentioned, first and foremost, if you are subject to one of these controls, you need to begin in mind when building your classification schema with this in front of you. If you aren't subject to one of these controls, although today's webinar subject is highly regulated industries, and so you likely already have one of these controls that you have to be beholden to. If you're not, we certainly do suggest that you start by looking at your environment and how closely it may align with some of the requirements from some of these control sets, and maybe develop a framework based on that. I don't know today of any framework that doesn't call for some level of identifying your data, whether it explicitly says you need to perform discovery and classification, or whether the language may be a little earlier written and simply calls for you to identify it. The reality of applying controls, whether they are technological, people, or process, without understanding what it is you're applying them to, is not a luxury that we should have ever had, but certainly not one that we have any longer.
Gabe, let me ask a follow-up, if I may, before we leave this. Just say hypothetically that you run a search with the discovery mechanism and you find something that's in a place it shouldn't be. Is there any way to automate remediation for that, or do you have to do everything by hand?
Good question, and we'll touch on this one again in a bit. You can automate quite a fair number of that activity these days. It was that in the past, and maybe even the not so distant past, that most of these activities had to have been performed manually. A large part of the traditional information lifecycle management process that most of us that grew up in the IT and security world are familiar with did require a lot of manual adhering to these types of classifications. As an attorney yourself, I'm sure that in in a very paper-driven world, as it still can be, a lot of these processes were forced to be adhered to by hand. So, for example, retention policies of sensitive information that's no longer required. In the past, that may have required you to physically shred something. Well, today we can automate that. We can discover something and then state that if this document with a class 3 type of information is found to have existed longer than X number of days, go ahead and automatically quarantine that information. Go ahead and automatically delete, shred that information, redact it. We can apply a lot of automated technical controls to those these days. We can alert the actual data stewards and maybe even department heads of these type of activities. So when we get into talking about what to measure and how, that's another one of those activities that we consider a best practice that should be automated. Simply notifying the correct individuals of the overall security posture of their sensitive data. So the answer to your question is we absolutely can automate as much of that as possible. And as we look at the maturity of a data security program, the goal is to attempt to automate as much of that as possible. It won't all be possible to automate. There's some things that you can't automate by the nature of the control itself. Something like a process control, an acceptable use policy. We'll ask employees to sign acceptable use documents, and we'll even have some mechanisms for enforcing some of those with technology controls, but ultimately you may not be able to enforce all of those things with technology. But with regards to labeling and classifying and taking actions based on those classifications, we certainly can automate the large part of that, if not all of it.
Fabulous. And one final question before we talk about monitoring. I just want to make sure that if a item, a file, for example, has a given classification, that doesn't just exist in a vacuum. I mean, other controls can read those and can work in concert with that. Is that correct?
So with the Spirion data platform, it absolutely can be. Anything short of that will create a scenario where interoperability and the ability to automate those controls, as you asked before, becomes increasingly difficult, if at all possible. So yes, as part of our overall vision for the way these types of programs should be enacted, those classifications absolutely should be readable by anything else, from humans to other machines. It should be human and machine readable. It should be interoperable and certainly be sticky. That is persistent with the documents also.
Okay, excellent. Actually, I just wanted to clarify that. Let's talk about monitoring and measuring. This is the fifth step in our system here. And when we say monitor and measure, not surprisingly, you have to have some kind of a early warning system, as I like to call it. So, and I'll just use an example from one of my clients. They have something called Alert Logic that reads their firewall or something else and essentially says, yes, you're having an incident, someone's trying to break into your network, or it's just an event and it's more suspect. So the idea that your control sets already have monitoring, I think that's pretty much old news for all of us, but I just wanted to clarify that. But you also have that distinctly just from the data classification side of things. There's very specific monitoring mechanisms that are baked into that. And Gabe, again, could you dig into that a bit?
Yep, absolutely. So one of the things that we built some time ago to help this along was the ability to enhance those traditional types of alerting controls with the additional context of the sensitivity of those documents. As you say, a number of those traditional controls are somewhat old hat, and part of what was lacking in those alerts was, okay, so there's this type of event happening, maybe in this location against this system, so on and so forth. But tell me about the sensitivity of the information within that system. Tell me about the sensitivity of the information within that specific event. Is that something that, again, as resources become more and more constrained, talking to someone earlier this week, that they're working in in a heavily regulated environment, and there's a team of 4 individuals that are responsible for this for this entire initiative. That's not a lot considering how many other things they're tasked with doing throughout their day. So being able to apply that contextual knowledge with those alert logics is something that is crucial to helping that process along. And monitoring those things as they happen and as they change is another core component to the Spirion data platform. That the sensitive data watcher applies throughout too.
So Gabe, just as a follow-up here, I want to make sure I understand correctly. So is it possible, for example, and I'm just going to say me as an attorney, but it could be really anyone in the organization, if I'm concerned that certain classes of data, for me it would be class 5 data, is somehow has the potential to be in the process of being mishandled, can I just get an email? Is there a mechanism where I can just email me and say, hey, by the way, did you know that this class 5 data just got copied onto a USB drive or something like that? I'm just using that as an example.
It's a great example, and it's an extremely common use case, in fact, so that there are a couple of things. You certainly may want to alert on that after the fact, but you may want to stop that event from happening as well too. So you can automate the control to stop that file from being copied to a certain location, uploaded, shared, so on and so forth, emailed, and certainly alert on it as well, so that the data owners, in your case, the person that is most concerned with, in this case, the level 5 classification documents being mishandled or otherwise exfiltrated, is alerted as soon as that happens. Yes.
Okay, and so potentially I can print that out in a report or something. And the reason I ask is that if I got, say, 5 of those in a week for whatever reason, bringing that to the data classification committee, or in my case, it would really be to the internal controls folks for unclassified controlled information, saying, guys, we've got a problem here. We shouldn't be getting any of these. We got 5 in a week. There's something going on here. That's the kind of report that I could create, presumably.
It is. Let's talk about another. Let's talk about something else really quickly as to why that's important, though. The ability to change user behavior is really going to be backstopped by a lot of this activity. So I may not have realized what I was doing was outside of the policy, and that is certainly something we see more often than not. As you mentioned earlier, it's kind of that negligence, right? It's the otherwise well-intentioned employee doing something that they otherwise should not have. But when we're able to highlight those things and point them out as they happen, we start driving actual change throughout the culture.
Okay, well, that's fabulous. Then let's go to the next one, which is auditing and testing. And as I mentioned when we first started here, that this is having a data classification control system, no different than any other control system that you may have in place. You're going to audit it and test to make sure it's working properly. One, because it's the same methodology that you would do if you were doing, say, Sarbanes-Oxley. And secondly, because you want to make sure that it really is working, period, not just for the sake of publishing something if you're a publicly held company. So let's go to the next slide and let's talk about that and really dig into this. So why audit and test? I just mentioned why we're doing that. We have frameworks and standards that I'm sure all of you adhere to at least one of these, if not more than one. And so they all require, at some point, to be audited and tested to make sure that the controls there's no weaknesses in the efficacy of those controls. So, Gabe, I'm going to come back to you again. What's the analog here if we want to do that from a data classification side of things?
Well, so first and foremost, there's always that necessity to do what we say we will do, and do what the actual regulations tell us that we need to be doing. That safe handling of data, that safe collection and sharing of that information. Those are the external pressures. We have our own internal reasons for doing that as well, right? The preparation in the event of a breach and making sure that data is safe from attackers and from misuse. And so with that, let's jump right ahead and talk about data security controls. on the whole. So we've already looked a lot at the process controls, right? So these are controls that are created by humans and aided by technology. You asked the question also, Scott, about being able to automate those. Absolutely, but it's going to first begin with creating the process, and that process is created by human beings. They're going to be the most informed about your sensitive data, and they'll understand the context of the data. They'll understand what is and isn't throughout your environment. And then using technology as a tool to enforce those decisions. So technology can't make those decisions for you. What does that mean? You can't simply pick up the phone, send an email, and ask, okay, I need a tool that is going to stop this type of information from leaving my organization. I need a tool that's going to discover this type of information for me. You have to be able to define what these things are, what the sensitive data types are that are important to you, why they're important to you, and how you apply the different controls. We talked about not applying controls broadly across everything, and Scott gave a great example of that, whereby we started with a classification schema that had 5 different levels, attempted to condense it down to 3, and how that impacted our ability to apply controls across the board. And so we can't just expect that technology controls will make those decisions for us. So
Gabe, can I jump in real quick here?
Yeah.
I just wanted to really reiterate what you just said about the people component of control. Is that putting together the data classification committee, having that inform the policy, which is wrapped around data classification matrix, really those 2 things are crucial to getting the controls in place, so you're getting the funding for the controls in place, and then finally having them enforced. And so all of those work together as a unit. But if you don't have the classification committee, if you don't set the policies and the standards of behavior that everyone's expected to observe, then none of this works. And you're right, people are the toughest part of this. But for better or for worse, if you're going to be classifying data, having the committee and having that policy be blessed by upper management, so they say, yes, we are going to hold people accountable if they're trained in how to use this and they don't use it, if they're trained to recognize they shouldn't be moving data in places where it shouldn't be, and they don't, then you have to have repercussions as a consequence. And that's, again, been the biggest problem. It's not getting the technology to work. That typically works great. It's always been getting people politically to respond.
Absolutely. And there's a good reason for that too, right? So a question that I still get quite often is, okay, so who exactly should be responsible for data security? And ostensibly the answer is everyone, but everyone can't be, right? Asking everyone to participate in all parts of the activity simply isn't useful. Having your employees be the only ones that are performing classification, asking them to choose the classification of documents and so on, at the very low level, the consumers, your data consumers, they don't see the value in data the way the owners do. For them, data is pretty commoditized. It's an end, it's a means to an end for them to perform their duties throughout the day. And at the very top, your executives are otherwise excuse me, responsible for strategy development and execution, and being burdened with what looks to them like an IT or security task also has that same challenge. So while the answer is everyone has a different role to play throughout this process. And so in this slide, I kind of highlighted those roles and how folks fit into that. The stakeholders, Scott has talked about these folks quite a bit. Everyone from the head of HR to the legal team and so forth. That's anyone who expects to derive some business value from the data. The actual owners of that data, and these roles may overlap. In some environments, these are going to be the same folks. Your stakeholders very well may be your owners. Excuse me, and those are the folks that are going to have ultimate say over the policy that gets applied to your sensitive information. That's the policy that we defined earlier on in our classification schema. We have our stewards, who are going to be the ones that are responsible for that quality and for actually drafting those policies in partnership with the data owners. And then the producers. Who are the producers? Well, that's truly everyone, because in today's business environment, sensitive data that we create isn't just, it's not just social security numbers. It's not just credit card numbers. It certainly exists within emails. Things that we type in exchange with colleagues, internal and external, can be confidential in nature. So our data producers are going to be most people in the organization that are responsible for creating and capturing data. And it's at the producer level where we want to automate absolutely as much of these controls and discovery and classification activities as possible for that reason, because it is most of those folks within the organization. All right, I want to try and get through these last couple of slides here with the remaining time we have left, just to kind of wrap up and put a bow in the process and see if anyone had any questions. So we talked also about measuring. This is by far not completely encompassing, but I wanted to present a couple of metrics that we find very useful in capturing when looking at how to measure your data security activities. So from the top down and the bottom up, top down being metrics that you may want to present to your senior management. The delta of a gap analysis from exercise such as looking at the frameworks you have in place, again, whether it be COVID or NIST or something derived on that, and then performing that activity on a yearly basis and looking at the improvements, hopefully the improvements and not the opposite. Looking at the number of files with sensitive data and looking at the corrective actions that have been taken against them. So let's take a working example. I have a system in place whereby I've applied and automated my classification schema, and I've located 25 million records of sensitive data. That's actually kind of a real one that I'm thinking of in my head. And looking at the number of actions that have been taken against that, in this scenario, we were able to come all the way down to 5,000 records that were necessary. So being able to produce metrics that show not just how much sensitive information is in the environment, but the types of actions that were taken against them and what we have left are very important to being able to share upwards throughout our environment to our management and so forth. If I jump down and kind of look at some of the bottom-up metrics, files that have had no action taken but that do have sensitive data. So Scott, to the question you were asking earlier, these are the types of metrics that I would want to report to someone like yourself who would be responsible for, again, those class 4 or 5 data sets. I would want to be able to tell you with some frequency, or have you be able to self-report on the number of files that do have, say, class 4 or 5 information, but that we haven't remediated, nothing has been taken against. You as the data in that scenario would need this information, again, to help drive those efforts forward and bring those numbers down. Or files that have had exceptions taken. So we're always going to have some exception process. There's no getting around that in business. There's always legitimate reasons, and sometimes kind of borderline edge cases for why something may need to fall outside of the processes we put in place. But we need to be able to see and measure those things as well. Anything there before I move on, Scott? All right.
No, we are good.
Excellent. So how to measure these? Well, so we also have an accompanying framework for implementing data security process improvements that's aimed at reducing that risk associated with the creation, handling, and transformation of sensitive data. It breaks down across 4 business functions: governance, vision, validation, implementation, and each one has 3 security practices below them, and each of those practices have a maturity level associated with them. So it's a capability model, right? So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that if you are at the very bottom of that you're somehow in a worse state than some other part of the organization or another external organization. It simply is to highlight the activities that you're performing and be able to make judgments as to where you need to improve. In some scenarios, you certainly may need to be at a measured and controlled state. For example, if you look at the governance business function and the security practice of compliance controls, most of us will need to be in a measured and controlled state there. If we look at the vision business function and we look at, say, modeling data threat actors, some of us may not have a need to perform that activity at all and be perfectly comfortable at the not performed portion of that maturity level. So this framework is intended to be a guideline for that process improvement, not a red, yellow, green marker of whether you're doing better or worse. What does that look like in practice? So similar to the impact calculus, we created a worksheet to help through that as well, and it covers most of the common activities that are carried out at the varying maturity levels. There's certainly other activities that could be considered, and you can adjust this as necessary. But what is important is achieving those desired outcomes and not simply performing an activity for the sake of doing so, but doing what we say we will do. So with that, I want to open the floor up to any questions. I know we're a minute over. There's certainly a lot more that we can power through. For those that are interested in seeing more on the last few slides with regards to that maturity model and the assessment worksheet, we do have a CPE course that we offer every, I want to say it's every once a quarter or maybe less. If you send us an email, I can certainly get you the schedule for the next upcoming one. But we have a data security class where we delve into these things at depth. I just wanted to present it today so that we could tie the overall process together, from implementing data classification strategy all the way through execution and improvement. Scott, anything you would like to add before we wrap up?
I think that covers it quite well.
All right.
Great job.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining today. There's certainly a lot of material to try and get through within an hour's time, which is why we do hold other sessions that break out these topics further and go a bit more in depth. This material is available, some of it on the website, some of it, if you contact us directly, we can work with you to produce what it is you need for your environment. And without further ado, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today. It's been my pleasure. And Scott, thank you so much for joining me on today's webinar.
Thank you for inviting me.